This is your professor, Dr. Brian Lippincott. Short video today about what Christians can learn from Jung and how Christianity and Jung ties in, and how Jung was very pastoral in his views, although he was very reductionistic and into science, because he came at the beginning of the 20th century and everything was physics and science, and Albert Einstein had just created his theory of relativity, and everything was big like that. And one of Jung's clients was Wolfgang Pauli, who was the Nobel Prize winning physicist. And so as Nietzsche said, God is dead, and we were grieving on the loss of our Christian beliefs. Jung brought some real embodiment and some real ways of working with God and with higher powers and all that from a variety of different perspectives. One of them was Christianity. In Jung's life, for I think it was 18 generations back, every one of his male relatives was a minister in the Swiss Reformed Church. So he had this whole history of spirituality that he was breaking away from by becoming a psychiatrist. So I'm going to dive right in.
Post-Enlightenment thinking left the modern mind with a hyper-rational, autonomous ego. We developed a highly self-sufficient center of consciousness that firmly believes it is the master of its own destiny, completely independent of any forces outside its direct control. This hyper-rational independence forces the religious psyche into a trap. Believers default to an entirely ethereal faith. Unable to connect spiritual concepts to physical reality, religion becomes a collection of abstract dogmas and propositional truths floating in the intellect, completely devoid of lived bodily experience. Many Christians look to depth psychology to solve this disconnect, but hesitate. There is a persistent fear that psychological analysis is inherently reductionist, that it exists only to explain away the divine, shrinking God into a mere psychological byproduct of the brain. Carl Jung approached the psyche differently. Operating at the height of modern secularism and scientific skepticism, Jung formulated his theories as a direct, prophetic pastoral response. He observed that humans possess a native religious instinct, and repressing it causes clinical pathology. Within this framework, Jungian metapsychology acts as a functional tool for the believer. It serves as the scaffolding necessary to deepen, organize, and revitalize a faith that has lost its physical grounding. This scaffolding operates like an architectural blueprint. The human encounter with the divine is inherently overwhelming. The psychological framework safely contains, organizes, and translates those massive spiritual experiences so the individual can actually process them. Without a rigorous psychological architecture to anchor it, Christian faith detaches from the reality of human suffering and floats away into empty intellectualism. To build this framework, we first have to dismantle the core assumption of the Enlightenment, the idea that the human soul is a singular, undivided, and entirely rational unity. This diagram visualizes what Jung called the plural psyche. The mind is not a monolith. It is a complex network comprised of multiple autonomous psychological realities, unhealed wounds, and archetypal forces competing for attention. Jung argued clinical health requires the individual to act as a host to this inner congregation. The therapist and the client must learn to actively listen to these competing, suffering fragments, rather than forcing them into an artificial, rigid unity. By mapping the plural psyche, we create a comparative matrix. We can take the abstract concepts of Christian theology on the left and translate them directly into actionable, clinical, psychodynamic realities on the right. For example, the core theological mystery of the Incarnation, God taking on human flesh, translates psychologically to somatic grounding. Spirituality cannot exist in the abstract. To be clinically and spiritually valid, faith must be anchored in the physical body. It has to directly address the raw, messy realities of human aggression, sexuality, and physical suffering. Similarly, the theological concept of the Holy Spirit maps to the Jungian framework of the unconscious. God does not communicate exclusively through historical texts. The unconscious acts as a vital, living medium, delivering information from the bottom up through spontaneous dreams, somatic symptoms, and symbols generated by the psyche. Finally, the theological concept of the Imago Dei, the image of God, translates to the Jungian concept of the self. This is the objective, transcendent center of wholeness that constantly organizes the psyche and decenters our ego. But Jungian analyst Ann Belford Ulanov draws a strict boundary here to prevent psychological idolatry. The self is not God. Looking at Ulanov's text, she clarifies that the self is an objective psychological structure. It is the mechanism within us that knows about God. It acts purely as a bridge, leading the ego toward a transcendent reality entirely independent of the human mind. Applying this translation matrix equips clinicians and theologians with a precise vocabulary. It provides a method to safely treat individuals who use rigid religious dogma as a shield to avoid their own psychological reality. The most critical work within this psychological architecture happens at its darkest foundation, the integration of the shadow. The personal shadow contains all the inferior, unpleasant traits, like rage, greed, and lust, that the conscious ego finds too painful to acknowledge. Rather than processing them, the ego represses them into the unconscious, locking them away like animals in a basement. Theologically, this maps directly to the concepts of sin and the fall. These shadow elements are not passive theoretical ideas. They are highly charged living affects that press fiercely for release. We repress them because we are terrified of dependence. We despise our own vulnerability, so we construct a mask of moral perfection and total control to hide our internal brokenness. Because the ego refuses to face these basement animals directly, the psychological pressure forces those traits outward. The individual unconsciously projects their own unacknowledged darkness onto an external target, a spouse, a neighbor, or a rival group. This diagram shows the architecture of the scapegoat. When this individual defense mechanism scales up to a collective level, a group takes its own unowned guilt and anxiety and piles it onto a designated target. Families and communities attack the scapegoat to maintain a highly defensive illusion of moral purity. They convince themselves they are bravely fighting evil, when in reality they are completely fleeing their own subjective darkness. Left unchecked, this cycle of collective shadow projection fuels intense tribalism. It rationalizes the complete destruction of outgroups under the guise of righteous zeal. Breaking this destructive cycle requires a specific psychological and spiritual antidote, the practice of confession. Effective confession retrieves our projections. It forces the individual to stop pointing at others' depravity and instead translate a vague sense of evil into highly specific, owned acts of personal sin. Jung termed this process mortificatio. It is the grueling sacrifice of our ego defenses, forcing us to humbly accept our own capacity for darkness. By standing at the foot of our own cross and owning our specific badness, the cycle of projection stops. It clears a space of genuine innocence, allowing healthy, separate relationships to finally be restored. In moments of extreme crisis, logical explanations fail. The human mind requires a third kind of knowing, a symbolic expression that can bridge our finite suffering and God's transcendence. The diaries of Etty Hillesum provide the historical proof of concept for this synthesis. Imprisoned in a transit camp during the Holocaust, she successfully integrated her shadow while surrounded by literal horror. Hillesum refused to use her ego to demand logical explanations for the atrocities happening around her. She recognized that intellectualizing the trauma would only fracture her psyche. Instead, she practiced a state of holy dependence. She radically decentered her ego, surrendering entirely to the present moment and accepting her complete lack of physical control. Her active integration of the shadow and her acceptance of her own plural psyche generated a psychological container of love. That internal structure proved vastly stronger than the abyss of human evil she was forced to endure. Depth psychology is not a replacement for religion. It is the structural tool we use to do the intrapsychic work of facing our shadow and organizing the competing voices of our inner congregation. Once the shadow is integrated and the fragmented parts of the soul are properly pastored, the clinical scaffolding has achieved its purpose. The psychological framework drops away. What remains is an individual capable of a profound, direct connection to the divine. A resilient, vitalized faith is only possible when we stop escaping into the safety of the intellect. True spiritual maturity requires us to encounter the living God with our whole, messy, and embodied selves.